Mazdak was likely born in Nishapur, Khorasan. Historians debate whether he was a disciple of Bundos or was influenced by his works, as Bundos lived about 200 years earlier. During the declining Sasanian era, Zoroastrian Mobeds exploited religion and amassed wealth, plundering the people. Bundos, a Zoroastrian magus, criticized these religious authorities for deviating from monotheism. Kavad I, the Sasanian king, sought to reduce the priest's power and supported Mazdak's movement. However, his son Anushirawan grew suspicious and requested 40 days to expose Mazdak. He discovered that Mazdak had convinced a disciple to hide and speak as fire, leading to Mazdak's exposure and his execution. Before discussing Mazdakism, it's better to understand the political and social conditions of the Sasanian era. The Sasanians, to prevent Roman expansionism and to create favorable conditions for commerce, required unity and political, military, and religious coherence. Therefore, following the model of the Achaemenids, they established a unified governmental and religious structure for society. Ardashir I, the founder of the Sasanian dynasty, declared Zoroastrianism as the official religion of the state from the beginning of his reign. The accuracy of this claim is confirmed by existing inscriptions. The Sasanians placed great importance on Zoroastrian priests, and during the Sasanian period, these priests held higher status and rank than other members of society. The situation progressed to the point where the religious authority surpassed the king's power, and the priests, exploiting religion and amassing great wealth, began to exploit the people. The Zoroastrian clergy, contrary to the teachings of the great prophet Zoroaster and the holy book of Avesta, were engaging in practices that served their own personal interests. As explained in the article about Prophet Mani, one of Mani's objectives was to fight against the influence and corruption of the Zoroastrian clergy within the royal court. Mani had garnered a large following in Europe and East Asia. However, due to the machinations of the Zoroastrian clergy, Mani was arrested and later hanged. Shortly after, Christianity also gained prominence in Iran during the 3rd and 4th centuries CE and attracted followers. Once again, the Zoroastrian clergy, fearing for their religion, used their power to convince the Sasanian kings to persecute Christian followers in Iran. It should be noted that from the time the Sasanians came to power, the Jewish community was also present in Iran, and they too faced considerable persecution during the Sasanian era. At that time, the cities of Hamadan and Isfahan had significant Jewish populations, and persecution was notably visible in those two areas. However, over time, the condition of the Iranian Jews improved. Under Shapur I, an understanding was reached between the Sasanian government and Jewish rabbis, ensuring that Iranian Jews would be treated with respect, similar to the Zoroastrians, and they became an integral part of Iranian society. The Jewish community in Iran remained loyal to the Persian army, even during the wars between Iran and Rome, unlike the Christians. As a result, the persecution of Christians in Iran continued. However, this wasn't the end of the story. Anti-Jewish sentiments surged at one point due to the killing of 2 Zoroastrian priests by Jews. This led to widespread massacres of Jews in the cities of Hamadan and Isfahan. This situation persisted until the reign of the 20th Sasanian king, Kavad I, when conditions began to stabilize to some extent. The main source of income for the people during that period was agriculture. However, ordinary people were peasants who owned no land and were subject to considerable oppression. From the inscriptions left from the Sasanian era, it's clear that the Persian system was largely based on feudalism, where landowners and nobles were wealthy, while the majority of the population, consisting of peasants, lived in poverty. The system in place during the Sasanian era was class-based, grounded in religion and power, forming an imperialistic structure. Sometimes these classes clashed, leading to uprisings within society, but the suppressive forces usually quelled these rebellions. In this context, French Orientalist Henri Massé points out an interesting fact. The Sasanian society was a conservative one where nobles and wealthy people held significant power. The order and regulations in society were very one-sided and unfair. During the Sasanian era, there were regulations known as the caste system. The caste system has a bitter yet intriguing history, and in some places, for example India, it is still practiced. The caste system implies rigid social stratification, meaning that whoever is born into a certain class has no right to move to another class and must remain in their assigned class for life. Here, it would be helpful to get acquainted with the 7 noble families that held power and influence in Iran from the Parthian to the Sasanian period: the House of Karen, the House of Mehran, the House of Zuran, the House of Spandiat, the House of Varaz, the House of Sepabodan, and the House of Zik. The state of the country during the reign of the 18th Sasanian king, Piruz I, became so disorganized that city populations grew, and farmers and peasants were unable to pay taxes. Fearing tax collectors, they fled from the villages to the cities. This issue persisted to the point where the government had trouble meeting the basic needs of people in large cities. On the other hand, a 7-year famine struck Iran, and the national treasury was plundered by princes and Zoroastrian clergy. The government increased pressure on the people to collect more taxes, but this wasn't the end of the story. In 484 CE, Piruz I was defeated in a battle against the Hephthalites in northeastern Iran and lost his life. Since Kavad I, the son of Piruz, had not reached the legal age, the throne was handed to his brother, Balash. In fact, the grandeur of the Sasanian Empire began to decline after the death of King Piruz I. Balash claimed the throne but couldn't reach an agreement with the clergy and nobility. The state treasury was empty, and the Iranian army was at its weakest. 4 years into Balash's reign, in 488 CE, he was blinded and deposed by the nobility, and the 16-year-old son of Piruz, Kavad, was placed on the throne. With the help of a man named Sukra, Kavad managed to stabilize the country's situation to some extent. Gradually, Sukra became the de facto ruler of the court, gaining popularity among the people. Sukra was highly skilled and shrewd, effectively managing the country's affairs. However, the young Kavad felt that Sukra would betray him. As a result, Sukra was killed on Kavad's orders. With Sukra's death, Iran lost one of the wisest political figures in its history. Subsequently, the young king devised a plan to finally curb the influence of nobles and Zoroastrian priests in state affairs. In the famous book Mino-ye Karad, written in the late Sasanian period in Pahlavi, the misdeeds of Zoroastrian clergy are described. Amidst this turmoil, a new movement began to emerge, a movement known as Mazdakism, which gained more and more popularity and reached its peak during the reign of Kavad I. Before analyzing the Mazdakite movement, it's worth getting to know the background of this ancient figure. Mazdak, which means wise or intelligent. Regarding Mazdak's birthplace, there are many differing opinions. Some believe he was born in Tabriz, while others say he was born in the Fars region. However, most sources point to Khorasan and the city of Nishapur. Mazdak's father was a high-ranking Zoroastrian priest in the Khorasan region. From the beginning of his life, Mazdak witnessed these social inequalities. He was passionate about equality and believed this class-based system needed to be abolished. In his speeches, Mazdak stated that God intended an equal share of both happiness and hardship for all humanity, and all people should equally benefit from God's blessings. In other words, Mazdak was an advocate of a socialist system, and he gradually gained popularity due to his persuasive oratory. At that time, when Kavad I was weary of the Zoroastrian priests, he decided to support Mazdak and the Mazdakite movement. Mazdak's supporters were ordinary people who were also tired of oppression and injustice. Interestingly, this movement was inspired by another uprising that had occurred a few years earlier. Years before, a man named Borndos had risen against the Zoroastrian clergy. Borndos himself was a Zoroastrian magus who believed the religious authorities were deviating from monotheism, not following the teachings of the prophet Zoroaster. He also heavily criticized the Sasanian government and urged the princes to abandon their aberrant behavior and return to Zoroastrian beliefs. One of Borndos's disciples was Mazdak. Borndos had spent some time in the Roman Empire, where he was influenced by Western philosophers, particularly Plato. Later, Borndos, fearing arrest and execution, left Iran and sought refuge in Rome. However, many believe Borndos was not contemporaneous with Mazdak but lived about 200 years before him, and later Mazdak read his works and was influenced by them. Regardless, Mazdak's beliefs and ideologies were influenced by the ideas of Mani and the philosophy of Borndos. The Mazdakite doctrine was a blend of Zoroastrianism in the Sasanian era, Manichaeism, and the customs and traditions of rural areas at that time. The Manichaeans had a famous slogan in their day: "He who is poor today will be rich tomorrow." The Manichaeans never succeeded in implementing this slogan, but the Mazdakites took it as the basis of their movement. Around the 3rd century CE, Borndos made significant changes to Manichaean beliefs. For example, in the original Manichaean view, at the end of the world, light never triumphs, and darkness always prevails. Borndos, however, changed this belief and asserted that ultimately, light would overcome darkness. Mazdak met with Kavad and asked him to support the Mazdakites comprehensively. Ferdowsi, in his epic work, the Shahnameh, mentions the meeting between Mazdak and Kavad. According to Reynold Elena Nicholson, contrary to what is said about Mazdak and his beliefs regarding good and evil, Mazdak's views on light and darkness were, in fact, quite similar to those of Mani and Zoroaster. In Mazdak's beliefs, there is a God, and God has 4 primary forces: knowledge, memory, understanding, and joy. These 4 forces manifest in 4 individuals, and these 4 are aided by 4 others in governing the world. Everything that happens in the world results from the interaction of these 4 forces. Abul Mali believes that Mazdak was also a Zoroastrian, just as Mani was, and both shared the same beliefs as Zoroaster, including a faith in the forces of light and darkness. Mani's doctrine was derived from ancient Iranian traditions, Christianity, and Buddhism. The fundamental principle of Mani's religion is known as dualism, indicating that there are 2 fundamental forces in the world: the force of light, called God or Ahura Mazda, and the force of darkness, known as Ahriman. These 2 forces are eternal and constantly in conflict with each other, and if there is discord in the world, it is due to the struggle between these 2 forces. Mani considers the body a product of the dark and evil world, while the soul is derived from goodness and light. However, this is where Mazdak's beliefs diverge significantly from those of Mani. The Manichaean prophets' concepts are largely focused on the afterlife and the mystical realm, while Mazdak's ideas are more grounded in the material world. Mazdak places a strong emphasis on living in the here and now. He believes in light and Ahura Mazda, stating, "The pure Yazdan, God, does everything with a sense of purity and knowledge," implying that God's actions are intentional and not random. According to Mazdak, unlike light, Ahriman, the force of darkness, has no will of its own, and everything in the dark world happens by chance. Mazdak argues that the dark world leads people toward envy, deceit, and wrongful actions. These wrongdoings in society create class disparities, where some become poor while others are so propertied they don't know what to do with their wealth. Mazdak, unlike Mani, believes that human actions contribute to the empowerment of darkness. The roots of cosmology in the beliefs of Mani or Mazdak can be traced back to Plato's philosophy. Plato believed that the physical world is a reflection of the spiritual realm, and the events and conditions in the physical world are often the opposite of the truths in the spiritual world. Mazdak considered the reign of Kavad I to be a representation of God's rule, and he believed that everything should be based on the teachings of Ahura Mazda. Despite his emphasis on material life, there are elements of asceticism and mysticism in Mazdak's thought. For example, he believed that to return to one's true self, one must free oneself from material desires. It seems that the mystical aspect of Mazdak's beliefs might have been influenced by Mani's teachings. Mazdak permitted relationships among kin but strictly prohibited killing animals and consuming their flesh and blood. However, he allowed the consumption of eggs. Mazdak's followers wore coarse and rough garments. Their lives were filled with hardship, self-discipline, and asceticism. The issue of marriage was a significant concern during Mazdak's time, with nobles having numerous harems and night quarters, and some becoming consumed by sexual indulgence. Gradually, incestuous marriages became more common in society. Since the Zoroastrian clergy saw the Mazdakites as their primary enemy, they spread rumors in the community, claiming that Mazdakites shared their wives with each other. Some historians believe that these rumors were completely false and that the reality was the opposite. The Mazdakites had strict sexual restrictions, and relationships between men and women were not as prevalent among them. The most important aspects of Mazdak's ideas were equality, justice, and humanitarianism, which led Allama Iqbal to refer to Mazdak as the prophet of the common people of ancient Iran. Some Western historians consider the Mazdakite movement to be a communist movement. To determine whether the Mazdak movement was truly communist, we must compare Karl Marx's ideas with those of Mazdak. From Marx's perspective, communism is a classless society where the means of production are collectively owned by the people, and complete social equality among all members is achieved. Marx promised the ultimate victory to the working class, a promise that closely resembles Mazdak's ideology of light ultimately triumphing over darkness. Marx defines two opposing poles as the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, whereas Mazdak identifies less defined classes in society. The deep divide between Marx and Mazdak becomes apparent when Marx calls on the working class to rise up, seize political power, and abolish private property. In contrast, Mazdak was not interested in creating a separate governing class to counter the nobility. Instead, he aimed to eliminate laws that caused poverty and misery for ordinary people. Mazdak was not fundamentally against private property. Marx had no religious perspective and even believed that the working class struggle would eradicate religion from society. Conversely, Mazdak had a religious and even mystical outlook. Marx believed that any means could be used to achieve the ultimate goal, which is why the methods to attain communist objectives often involved violence. Mazdak, on the other hand, was against bloodshed and advocated for peace. With the support of Kavad, Mazdak compiled his beliefs and doctrines in a book called Zend. Gradually, neighboring countries became aware of Mazdak's ideas and began to support his teachings. The Zoroastrian clergy tried everything they could but were unable to overcome Mazdak. Ultimately, it was the Sasanian princes who intervened. They realized that as long as Kavad remained in power, they couldn't act against Mazdak. The nobles dethroned Kavad after 10 years of his reign, and in 496 CE, they sent him to Khuzestan. There, a fortress called the Fortress of Oblivion housed political prisoners, where Kavad was also imprisoned. After Kavad's removal, his brother Jamask became the king. Kavad still had loyal supporters, and with their assist, he escaped from the fortress and fled to the Hephthalites in northeastern Iran. In 499 CE, Kavad returned to Iran without war or bloodshed and reclaimed the throne with the Hephthalites' support. Kavad paid the Hephthalites a significant annual tribute as a gesture of gratitude. Kavad also engaged in wars with the Romans, which opposed Mazdak's beliefs, as the Mazdakites were against any form of war and bloodshed. Despite all this, Kavad continued to support the Mazdakite faith, and even his eldest son, Kavuz, who was the governor of Tabaristan, became a follower of Mazdak. However, his other son, Khosrow Anushirwan, opposed the Mazdakite faith. Khosrow Anushirwan believed that Mazdak was a threat to the Sasanian throne and told his father that Mazdak intended to undermine them both and, most importantly, was a traitor and a liar. The story of Mazdak and Anushirwan is one of the most intriguing in Sasanian history. Kavad told his son to prove that Mazdak was a liar and show what lies he was spreading. Anushirwan replied that Mazdak claimed that the fire in the fire temple could speak, which wasn't possible. Anushirwan was right, Mazdak had lied. He used a trick and had one of his disciples hide in the fire temple so that when Mazdak started speaking to his followers, this disciple would praise Mazdak's teachings as if the fire itself were speaking. Khosrow Anushirwan said that if Mazdak could make water, air, and earth speak, he would become his supporter. In the presence of the court, Kavad asked Anushirwan how he would prove that Mazdak was a liar. Khosrow Anushirwan requested 40 days to find a skilled magus to debate with Mazdak and expose him. 40 days passed, and Anushirwan had just found a wise old man from Fars. The elder was brought to Ctesiphon, and all the dignitaries gathered, with Mazdak also in attendance, to hold the debate. In the presence of the court, Mazdak told Kavad that if the wise old man lost the debate, both he and Anushirwan would be killed. Anushirwan had told the old man about the story of the talking fire days earlier, but Mazdak wasn't an easily intimidated individual. He was indeed a significant and wise figure, even experienced in astrology. The elder's first question to Mazdak was about his stance on communal sharing of women. He asked, if 20 men have relations with a single woman, and she becomes pregnant and gives birth to a child, who would be considered the father? Mazdak replied, I did not advocate communal sharing of women, rather, I believe that everyone, rich or poor, should have an equal opportunity to enjoy worldly wealth and women. However, in recent years, this was not the case. Most young men couldn't afford to marry even one woman, while nobles own harems and have relationships with dozens of women. The elder was met with a wise response from Mazdak to every question he asked, hence, he decided to play his trump card, the story of the speaking fire. Mazdak, aware of the plan, instructed 2 of his followers the night before to arm themselves and hide in a place within the fire temple, and if the elder and Kavad entered the fire temple, they were to kill both of them. If they succeeded, Mazdak promised to make them his future commanders. Anushirwan, still suspicious of Mazdak, advised his father to conceal a weapon under his clothes if he were to go to the fire temple. That night, everyone gathered at the fire temple, and the elder asked Mazdak to communicate with the fire. Mazdak began to speak, and the person pretending to be the fire said, I am weakening and must feed on the heart and soul of Kavad to survive. Mazdak turned to the assembly and said they must throw Kavad into the fire because it was the sacred fire's command. Some of the people, believing the trick, urged Kavad to enter the fire, but the wise elder asked everyone to wait a moment. Meanwhile, Khosrow Anushirah I bribed one of Mazdak's followers and asked him to reveal the truth. The man confessed that a pit had been dug beneath the fire temple, and through a hole, the voice of one of Mazdak's people could be heard. When Mazdak left the fire temple, government agents found and arrested the man who had been hiding. The next day, Kavad ordered Mazdak and all his followers to gather at the royal palace. According to Khosrow Anushirah I's command, Mazdak and his followers were to be beheaded. A large crowd gathered at the palace. Thousands of people were thrown into a pit, and all were killed. Finally, Anushirah I turned to Mazdak and said, "You were after the throne of Iran, and now your punishment is nothing but death." They shackled Mazdak in chains, threw him into a well, filled it with earth, and covered it, ending his life in this tragic manner, relegating him to history. Afterward, Anushirah I turned to his father, Kavad, as he felt that his father's poor decisions were leading the kingdom to ruin. With the support of the courtiers, Anushirah I imprisoned Kavad and seized power. Kavad ruled for 43 years and died in 531 CE. After Mazdak's death, the movement did not disappear. His wife, a woman named Khorramah, became the standard bearer for the movement. In the years that followed, out of respect for Khorramah, the movement's name changed to the Khorramite movement. After the rise of Islam and the murder of Abu Muslim Khorasani, his followers, seeking to avenge his death, allied with the mountain-dwelling Mazdakites, who by that time were known as Kharamites. The Kharamites launched major uprisings against the Abbasids, with the most notable being the rebellion of Babak Khorramdin in Azerbaijan. Babak Khorramdin achieved remarkable victories against the Abbasids, but ultimately, he was betrayed by his friend Afshin, captured by the Abbasids, and then killed. Many believe the Kharamites were distinct from the Mazdakites, but some sources suggest that the Kharamites were a continuation of the Mazdakite tradition. It is true that after Mazdak's murder, his followers were left in disarray and couldn't regain their former stability and position. However, after the Arab invasion, especially during the Umayyad and Abbasid periods, there were numerous uprisings by the Mazdakites against the occupying forces. The Mazdakites fought alongside Zoroastrian Iranians until their last breath to prevent foreign interference in Iran's affairs. If you enjoyed this video, do not forget to like it, and share it with your friends. Do not hesitate to provide your view regarding this video by putting your comments below. Your comments would help us to improve our work, and also, they help us to take your views into account for the future topics that we select. Furthermore, you can subscribe to our channel to become aware of our new videos.